My dad kicked me out, calling me a failure. Then he paid for my ultimate revenge. I never thought I'd say this, but my entire life was built on a lie. The father who abandoned me, the mother who stayed silent. Turns out they were hiding something far worse than I ever imagined. A secret so dark, it changed everything I thought I knew about myself. What if I told you that I had a sister, one I was never supposed to know existed? This is the story of how I uncovered the ultimate betrayal, and how I fought to bring the truth to light. Stay with me, because what I found will leave you speechless. I never imagined I'd be standing here, beneath the dazzling lights of one of the most prestigious ballrooms in Manhattan, surrounded by some of the greatest minds in science and education. The hum of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, the faint echoes of a string quartet in the background, it all felt surreal. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my achievements, a moment to finally breathe in everything I had worked for, fought for, bled for. But as I stood there, taking in the grandeur of it all, I felt an unmistakable chill creep up my spine. It wasn't stage fright, and it wasn't imposter syndrome. I had earned my place here. No, this was something else. A shadow from my past. I had spent years trying to outrun the ghosts of where I came from, but the past has a funny way of finding you, no matter how far you go. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just cruel irony, but as I stepped into the restroom, taking a brief moment to compose myself before the award ceremony began, I came face to face with the one person I had spent nearly 2 decades trying to forget. My mother. She was standing at the sink, reapplying a shade of red lipstick that hadn't changed since I was a kid. She still looked the part, the perfectly coiffed blonde hair, the emerald green gown that hugged her frame like it had been made for her, the posture that screamed old money and effortless control. For a second, I thought she wouldn't notice me. Maybe she wouldn't recognize me at all. But then her eyes flicked up to the mirror, landing on my reflection. Her hands stilled mid-motion, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I saw something crack in her composure. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed it over. Talia. She said my name like it was a formality, like we had just bumped into each other at a country club instead of here, in this bathroom, after 17 years of silence. I swallowed, gripping the edge of my clutch a little tighter. I knew this moment was inevitable, if not tonight, then someday. But I had spent so long preparing for it, rehearsing all the things I might say, and now that it was happening, my mouth felt dry. I could say the same, I finally managed, keeping my voice steady, unreadable. Didn't expect to see you here. She turned then, fully facing me, and for a moment, I could see the same old tension in her stance, the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight pursing of her lips. She was calculating, deciding how to play this. Your father and I were invited, of course, she said, smoothing the hem of her gown, like that simple motion could erase the years of distance between us. We've always been involved with organizations that support education. The way she said it, like it was an obligation rather than a passion, made my stomach twist. That was always the difference between us, between them and me. To them, education was a tool, a stepping stone to social prestige, a name to be engraved on some donor wall. To me, it had been survival. And you? She asked, lifting a delicate eyebrow. I could have played coy, let her wonder, but the bitterness inside me refused to let the moment pass without making my presence known. I'm being honored tonight, I said, meeting her gaze head-on, for my work in sustainable chemistry and education. There. I said it. I wanted to see it, the flicker of surprise, the brief moment where she would have to reconcile the version of me she had abandoned with the reality standing in front of her now. And I saw it. It was there just for a second before she masked it with indifference. I see, she said, simply turning back to the mirror, adjusting her lipstick like nothing had changed. Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually. The words were like a slap, sending me hurtling back to that night. The last time I had seen her. I was 20 years old, standing in our grand living room, clutching my acceptance letter to a community college, while my father paced the room, his voice shaking with rage. "The Monroe name has standards," he had said, disgust dripping from every syllable. "And you've done nothing but drag us down." I remember the weight of the duffel bag I carried out of that house that night. I remember how my mother never even looked up from her phone, how she sat on that pristine white couch, scrolling, as if I didn't exist. I had walked out into the cold, with nowhere to go, no plan, just the suffocating certainty that I was on my own. And now, here she was, acting like my entire journey had been nothing more than an afterthought. My nails dug into the leather of my clutch, but I forced myself to exhale, to loosen my grip. I wasn't that scared, desperate girl anymore. I wasn't standing in that living room begging for their approval. I had built my life without them, and now they were just spectators to a story they had no claim over. She turned to leave, and for a moment, I considered stopping her, saying something, anything. But what would be the point? There were no apologies waiting for me in her eyes, no warmth, no regret, just a woman who had already moved on, the same way she had all those years ago. I let her walk away, and when I stepped out of that restroom, back into the golden glow of the ballroom, I held my head a little higher, because for the first time in 17 years, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I didn't need them anymore. I stepped out of the restroom, my pulse still racing, the encounter with my mother lingering in my mind like the aftertaste of something bitter. The grandeur of the gala, the laughter, the perfectly polished conversations, none of it felt real anymore. I had spent years building myself up, distancing myself from them. Yet the moment I saw her, it was as if I had been yanked back to a past I had no interest in reliving. I told myself to shake it off. Tonight was mine. No ghosts from the past, no reminders of who I used to be. I squared my shoulders and walked back into the ballroom, head held high, determined to reclaim the evening. The waitstaff floated through the crowd, balancing silver trays with flutes of champagne, and the hum of conversation filled the space. I spotted Dr. Calloway, one of my mentors from Cambridge, chatting animatedly with a group of colleagues near the stage. I started toward him, needing the comfort of familiar faces, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone, that made my breath catch. Him. My father. I froze. He stood near the far end of the ballroom, a whiskey glass in hand, his back turned slightly, but I would recognize that rigid posture anywhere. He hadn't changed much. His graying hair was still neatly combed, his expensive suit tailored to perfection. Even from a distance, he exuded that same air of quiet authority, the same presence that once made me shrink under his gaze. I knew this moment was inevitable, but that didn't mean I was ready for it. He turned slightly, and for a fraction of a second, our eyes met. My stomach nodded. There was no warmth, no surprise, just the briefest flicker of recognition before his expression hardened into something unreadable. Then, just as quickly, he turned away, dismissing me like I was a passing stranger. I should have expected that. I should have been prepared for the way he would act like I didn't exist, like I was still that insignificant girl who had let him down. But the sting of it, the way it settled deep in my chest, was enough to make me clench my fists. I reminded myself who I was now, what I had accomplished. He had no power over me anymore. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, even as my heart pounded against my ribs. "Talia?" The voice startled me, pulling me out of my thoughts. I turned to see Dr. Calloway standing beside me, his brow furrowed in concern. "You all right?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just long night." He nodded knowingly, offering me a glass of wine from a passing waiter. "I imagine so. You deserve this moment. Don't let anything take that from you." I appreciated his words, but part of me knew that no matter how much I had built for myself, no matter how far I had come, there would always be a part of me that wanted to prove something to them, to show them they were wrong, to make them see me. But if tonight had shown me anything, it was that they never would. A chime rang through the ballroom, signaling the start of the awards presentation. The crowd slowly shifted toward the stage, and I followed, forcing my mind back to the reason I was here. I took my seat near the front as the host stepped up to the podium, a wide smile on her face. She spoke about the importance of innovation in education, the need for groundbreaking research in sustainable chemistry things I had dedicated my life to. Then my name was called. Applause filled the room, and I stood, smoothing the fabric of my dress before making my way to the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding, but I forced myself to focus, to breathe. I stepped up to the microphone, scanning the sea of faces in the audience. There were people who had believed in me, mentors, colleagues, students who had looked up to me. And then there was him, my father, sitting stiffly near the back, his expression unreadable, his presence like a weight pressing down on me. I took a breath. "I never thought I'd be here," I began, my voice steady. Not because I didn't believe in myself, but because for a long time I was told I would never be enough, that I wasn't the right kind of student, that I didn't have the right credentials, that I didn't belong in spaces like this. The room was silent, hanging on my words. "I stand here today because I refuse to believe that," I continued, "because I knew that education isn't just for those born into privilege. It's for those who fight for it, who struggle for it, who refuse to give up even when the world tells them they should." There was more applause, but I barely heard it. My gaze flickered to my father, searching for any reaction, anything at all. But his face remained impassive, cold. "And now," the host said, stepping back up, "we have an extraordinary announcement. In recognition of this work, an anonymous donor has pledged a grant of $2 million to support the continued efforts of tonight's honoree." The words hit me like a tidal wave. $2 million? Gasps rippled through the audience. Even I was stunned. This wasn't something I had expected. The sheer magnitude of the grant, the impact it would have, it was overwhelming. I turned slightly, scanning the crowd, searching for the donor. Who had done this? Why? Then, in the far corner of the room, I saw something. My father, standing up abruptly. His face was no longer impassive, it was twisted in something close to disgust. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew. He hadn't known. The donation, the $2 million. It had come from his company, Mosaic Industries. His empire. The irony crashed into me like a freight train. The same man who had thrown me out of his house, who had dismissed me as a failure, had unknowingly funded the very award that now stood as proof that I had never needed him. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as realization dawned on him. And then, just as suddenly as he had stood, he turned and walked out. I watched him go, the ballroom dead silent, every pair of eyes shifting between him and me. The applause started again, but it felt distant, hollow, because the one thing I had wanted, the one moment where he would have to see me, to acknowledge what I had become, he couldn't even stay for. He couldn't bear it. And, in that moment, standing under the bright lights, $2 million to my name, the entire room celebrating me, I had never felt so small. Just when I thought my father's betrayal was the worst thing he could do, I discovered something that shattered me even more. My mother's confession led me to a locked box, a single letter, and the truth I never saw coming. But here's the real question: if my sister was taken, where is she now? And does she even know I exist? Before I reveal what I found next, tell me in the comments, do you think my father erased her completely? Type 1 if you think she's out there, or 2 if you think the truth is even darker. The moment my father walked out of that ballroom, something inside me snapped. I had spent years preparing for this, years imagining the day he would finally have to face what he had done, face me. I thought that when it happened, when I finally stood on a stage like this, with my name being applauded and my work being recognized, he would have no choice but to acknowledge that I had made something of myself, that I had won. But instead, he had left. No words, No confrontation, no bitter remark, just a look of disgust, and then an exit, like he couldn't stand the sight of me. The applause still rang through the room, but it felt muted, like I was hearing it from underwater. I forced a smile, gripping the edges of the podium to steady myself. I had a speech prepared, words I had carefully crafted to sound poised and professional, but they suddenly felt empty in my mouth. I cleared my throat and spoke anyway, forcing myself to focus on the people who were still here, the people who had believed in me, who had helped me get to this moment. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "This honor means more than I can put into words. Science and education have been my life's passion, and to have my work recognized in this way, it's beyond anything I ever imagined." I exhaled, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. I believe that education belongs to everyone, not just the privileged, not just the ones who were expected to succeed. It belongs to the ones who had to fight for it. The ones who were told they weren't enough, who had doors shut in their faces, who were left to figure it out on their own. And this grant, this incredible generosity, will help make that belief a reality for so many. I heard the murmurs of approval, saw the nods from the crowd. I could feel their support, but all I could think about was the man who was no longer there. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Handshakes, congratulations, champagne glasses being raised in my honor. But my mind was somewhere else. I excused myself as soon as I could, weaving through the sea of gowns and tuxedos, making my way toward the exit. I didn't even know what I was doing, what I wanted to do, but my legs moved on their own. By the time I reached the street, the cool night air hit me like a slap. The city lights flickered against the pavement, cars honked in the distance, and there, near the curb, was my father. He was standing beside his sleek black car, his hands braced against the roof like he was trying to steady himself. His driver stood a few feet away, clearly sensing the tension, choosing to look anywhere but at us. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Dad." He didn't turn right away. His fingers curled against the metal of the car, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow, measured breath. Then, finally, he faced me. His eyes were colder than I remembered, sharper, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "What do you want, Talia?" His voice was flat, detached, like he was already done with this conversation before it had even begun. I swallowed hard. "You left." His jaw clenched. "So?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "So? That's all you have to say?" "You walked out the second they announced the donor. The second you realized your money, your company had funded my success." He didn't deny it. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know, did you?" I pressed. "When you made the donation, you had no idea it would be me standing up there. That's why you left." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite anger either. "You think I would have given a dime if I had known?" I stiffened, the words slicing through me sharper than I expected. "That money wasn't meant for you," he continued. "It was meant for someone deserving." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "And yet, here we are," he scoffed, shaking his head like the whole thing was some cruel joke. "You really think this means anything, Talia? A grant? An award? You think this changes what you are?" I felt something inside me tighten, but I refused to look away. "And what am I, Dad?" His gaze darkened. "You're still the girl who wasn't good enough, still the one who disappointed me. No amount of awards will change that. I should have been prepared for it. I should have known after all these years that this man would never give me what I wanted. But some small, stupid part of me had still hoped." I squared my shoulders, my nails digging into my palms. "You know what? You're right. None of this changes anything for you." I stepped closer, meeting his eyes, refusing to back down. "But it changes everything for me. Because I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need you." His expression didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. A crack. A sliver of something unspoken. but he didn't say a word. He turned, pulled open the car door, and without another glance, he got inside. I stood there as the engine roared to life, as the car pulled away, disappearing into the traffic. And then, for the first time in my life, I realized something. I wasn't chasing his approval anymore. I wasn't waiting for some grand moment of redemption, for some admission that he had been wrong about me. I had won, not because of the award, not because of the money, but because for the first time he was the one running away from me. I stood there on the sidewalk long after his car disappeared into the stream of Manhattan traffic, the cold night air wrapping around me like a second skin. My fingers curled into fists, my nails pressing into my palms as if the pressure could somehow keep my emotions from spilling over. I should have felt victorious. I had told him off, walked away with my dignity intact, and for once, it was him who had run, but all I felt was hollow, like a weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite name. I exhaled sharply, forcing my legs to move. The city was still alive around me, couples laughing as they hailed cabs, groups of people spilling out of bars, the distant honk of impatient drivers. It all felt so removed from me, like I was watching it happen through glass. I needed to get back inside, needed to finish what I had come here for. I wasn't about to let him take this night from me. I pushed back through the revolving doors of the hotel, the warmth of the grand lobby hitting me instantly. A few lingering guests milled around, sipping drinks, murmuring conversations blending into the soft piano music playing in the background. I smoothed my dress, inhaled deeply, and made my way toward the ballroom, preparing myself to slip back into the version of me that belonged here, the version that wasn't affected by a man who had walked out of my life long before tonight. But as I stepped inside, I felt the shift immediately. The energy in the room had changed. The polite murmurs had turned into hushed whispers, eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. Something was wrong. Then I spotted Dr. Calloway, standing near the stage, his expression tight. The moment he saw me, he started toward me, weaving through the crowd with urgency. "Talia!" he said under his breath, gripping my elbow lightly. "Are you okay?" I blinked at him. Yeah, I'm fine. What's going on?" He hesitated, glancing around before leaning in slightly. "Your father." He caused a bit of a scene before he left. My stomach turned. "What do you mean?" Calloway exhaled, lowering his voice. He didn't just walk out. He made sure everyone knew exactly why he was leaving. I stiffened. "What did he say?" "He told the board members that the grant was a mistake, that if he had known the recipient was you, he never would have allowed it." He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, his expression troubled. "He called you an embarrassment, Talia." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. It wasn't like I hadn't heard it before in different ways, in different tones. But knowing he had said it here, in front of people who respected me, in front of colleagues, mentors, strangers who now had this ugly piece of my history thrown in their faces, it made my stomach churn. "I see," I said, my voice carefully neutral. Calloway studied me, his eyes filled with something close to concern. "You don't have to do this tonight," he said gently. "If you need to step away, take a moment, no?" The word came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't correct myself. "I'm not letting him take this from me." He nodded, understanding. I turned back toward the crowd, toward the stage, toward the people who were still waiting to hear from me. If my father wanted to leave behind a mess in his wake, fine. Let him. But I wasn't going to clean it up for him. I was going to own it. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I made my way through the tables, through the lingering stares and the not-so-subtle glances. When I reached the stage, the host met me with a cautious smile, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I took the microphone before she could say anything. "I imagine some of you are wondering what just happened," I said, letting my gaze sweep across the room. "So let me save you the trouble. Yes, that was my father. Yes." He made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with this award. Or with me. I let the words settle, let them sink into the space between us, and that's okay. A murmur rippled through the audience, but I held my ground. My father has spent years pretending I don't exist. Tonight was no different, but the truth is, I do exist. And not only do I exist, I thrive. Without him, despite him, because of every door he slammed in my face, every time he told me I wasn't good enough, every time he made me believe I would never be anything beyond the girl he threw away, I stand here now, proof that he was wrong. Silence, then applause. Not hesitant, not polite, loud. It started in the back, then spread, a wave of sound crashing over me, filling up the spaces he had tried to hollow out. I exhaled, gripping the microphone a little tighter. So if my father wants to walk out on me, let him. But I'll tell you this, his money, his name, his power, none of it matters anymore. Because for the first time, he's not the one writing the story. I am. The applause grew louder, filling my ears, my chest, every inch of me that had once been weighed down by his rejection. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. As the applause thundered through the ballroom, I stood there, gripping the microphone like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. My heart pounded against my ribs, but not with fear. It was something else, something raw, something burning, something that felt dangerously close to liberation. I had spent my whole life chasing this moment, waiting for the day I would finally stand tall in a room filled with people who mattered and prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was more than my father's disappointment. And now that it had finally come, I wasn't sure how to feel. The noise eventually settled, but the energy lingered, crackling in the air like static before a storm. I stepped away from the podium, nodding in gratitude as people at the nearest tables met my gaze with expressions of respect, of admiration, some even of quiet understanding. I had just laid my wounds bare for the world to see, and instead of pity, all I saw was recognition. They got it. They felt it. I made my way back to my seat, my hands still slightly trembling from the adrenaline. Dr. Calloway was already there, waiting. He leaned in as I sat down, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "That," he said, shaking his head with a small, impressed smile, "was one hell of a speech." I let out a breathless laugh, rubbing my palms together to steady myself. "It wasn't planned. That's what made it powerful," he replied. "You didn't just take control of the moment, Talia. You owned it." I wanted to believe that, but there was still a knot in my stomach, a lingering tightness in my chest. No matter how many people clapped, no matter how many reassuring smiles were sent my way, the truth remained my father had walked out, and I had let it get to me. Before I could respond, a waiter appeared beside me, placing a glass of champagne on the table. But it wasn't just for me. A folded note sat beside the flute, crisp and precise, like whoever had written it had taken great care. My fingers hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the weight of the paper, the slight indentation of the pen strokes, it felt personal, intentional. I unfolded it. Just one sentence, written in neat, slanted script. "Come to the balcony. We need to talk." No name. A rush of unease crawled up my spine. My first instinct was suspicion. Had my father sent this? No. He wasn't the type to leave cryptic notes. If he had something to say, he would have said it to my face before storming out. Dr. Calloway must have seen the shift in my expression, because he frowned. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, then forced a small nod. "Yeah, I need some air." He studied me for a second, clearly unconvinced, but didn't push. I slid the note into my clutch and stood, making my way toward the side entrance that led to the balcony. The hotel's architecture was grand, old money opulence mixed with modern elegance, and the balcony overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan. The cold air hit me immediately, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. And then I saw her, my mother. She stood near the railing, her gown flowing slightly in the night breeze, the city lights casting shadows across her perfectly composed face. She didn't turn when I stepped forward. She didn't acknowledge me at all. For a long moment, it was just silence, just the distant hum of traffic below and the sharp sound of my heels clicking against the stone floor as I moved closer. "You left me a note," I finally said, breaking the stillness. She turned then, just slightly, her profile illuminated by the ambient glow of the city. "I thought you might not come," she admitted. I crossed my arms, keeping my expression unreadable. "And yet, here I am," she exhaled, a quiet sound, before fully turning to face me. There was something in her eyes. I couldn't quite place something that almost looked like hesitation. But my mother wasn't the kind of woman who hesitated. "I heard what your father said," she said after a beat. "Before he left." My jaw tightened. "Of course you did." She tilted her head, studying me like I was something foreign, something she couldn't quite figure out. "You know," she murmured, "I always wondered if you'd come back." I blinked, caught off guard. "Come back? To us?" she clarified, her voice still impossibly smooth, as if she were discussing the weather. "To the family. After you left, after you started making a name for yourself, I thought, maybe at some point you'd realize that the easiest thing to do would be to come back." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean after I was successful enough that I wouldn't embarrass you?" She didn't flinch. "After you built something for yourself, something worth coming back to." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. "I was never the one who left, Mother. You did. When you sat there, silent, while Dad threw me out. When you let him make me feel like I was nothing." My voice was steady, but I could feel the sharp edge of emotion clawing its way up my throat. "I spent years waiting for you to come after me, to call, to care." Her gaze flickered, the first real sign of emotion breaking through the perfect mask she always wore. "I did care," she said quietly, "just not enough to do anything about it." I shot back. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she exhaled. "Your father. He's a difficult man." I shook my head, letting out a dry chuckle. "No, he's a cruel man, and you let him be." She didn't deny it. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out something small, something silver. "A key." I frowned. "What is that?" "A safety deposit box," she said simply. "It's yours now." I hesitated before taking it, the cold metal pressing against my palm. "Why?" Her lips pressed together for a moment before she spoke. "Because I can't fix the past. But there are things you deserve to know." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" She held my gaze for a long time before finally saying, "Go find out." And then, just like my father, she turned and walked away. Only this time, I wasn't sure how I felt about watching her leave. I stood there on the balcony long after my mother disappeared through the ballroom doors, the weight of the small silver key pressing into my palm like it carried the answers to questions I hadn't even dared to ask. The night air wrapped around me, cool and sharp, but it wasn't enough to settle the storm raging inside my chest. I had spent so many years believing that my mother had simply chosen to let me go, that she had turned away without a second thought. And yet now she had handed me this something, some remnant of a past she had never acknowledged, something that might change everything. I clenched my fist around the key, my mind racing. What could she possibly be keeping from me? A part of me wanted to shove it deep into my clutch and forget it existed, to walk back into that ballroom, finish this night, and pretend like she hadn't just cracked open a door I had long since nailed shut. But I knew myself too well. I wouldn't be able to let it go. My feet moved before my mind fully caught up, carrying me through the side entrance of the ballroom, down the marble hallway, past glittering chandeliers and waiters offering glasses of champagne. I had no intention of drinking. I barely registered the curious glances as I passed by familiar faces. All I could think about was getting out. By the time I reached the lobby, my pulse was hammering in my ears. I stepped outside, the city stretching wide and endless before me, lights flickering in the windows of skyscrapers, taxis honking at pedestrians who had no business jaywalking in this part of town. The weight of the night pressed against me, but I didn't stop. I hailed a cab, slid into the back seat, and gave the driver an address. I hadn't spoken aloud in years. The bank was a short drive away, one of those towering financial institutions that looked the same no matter where you were cold, impersonal, built on wealth and secrets. I stepped out onto the curb, my heels clicking against the pavement, my heart lodged somewhere between anticipation and dread. I had no idea what I was about to walk into, but there was no turning back now. Inside, the late-night security guard barely looked up as I made my way to the private access area, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The clerk at the desk gave me a skeptical glance, eyeing my evening gown before flicking his gaze down to the key in my hand. "Do you have identification?" I nodded, sliding my ID across the counter. He examined it, then typed something into his system before nodding and gesturing toward the security door. "Third row, box 72. Box 72. My fingers tightened around the key as I stepped through the metal doors, the sterile scent of paper and metal filling my lungs. The room was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation system. I found the box easily, nestled among countless others, each one undoubtedly holding something important to someone, a history locked away behind thick metal walls. I slid the key into the lock, my breath catching for just a second before I turned it. The door clicked open. Inside, there was no stack of money, no deed to some secret inheritance. Just a single, weathered envelope with my name written on the front in my mother's delicate handwriting. I stared at it, my mind screaming at me to open it, to tear it apart and finally understand why she had given me this. Why now of all times? But my hands hesitated, my fingers brushing over the paper like I could feel the weight of whatever was inside before I even read it. With a deep breath, I slid the letter from the envelope, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "Talia, if you're reading this, then I suppose I finally found the courage to give it to you. I should have done it years ago. I should have done so many things differently." I swallowed, my throat suddenly tight. "I never wanted you to believe that I didn't love you. I know that's probably impossible to accept after everything. I know I failed you. But there are things you never knew. Things I was too afraid to tell you when you were younger, when you were still trying so hard to earn a place in a family that was never going to accept you the way you deserved. Your father was never going to let you win, Talia. Not because you weren't enough, but because he needed someone to blame. And I let him. I let him push you away because I was too much of a coward to stand against him." My breath shuddered as I read those words, my fingers trembling slightly. "But there's one thing I need you to know, one thing I can't leave unsaid any longer. You weren't the only one he cast aside." I blinked, rereading the line as if I had misunderstood it. My pulse quickened, a strange, gnawing feeling curling in my stomach. Your father has spent his entire life controlling the narrative, deciding who mattered and who didn't. And when he couldn't control someone, he erased them. I watched him do it to you, and I watched him do it to someone else before you were even born. My chest tightened. Your sister. The words hit me like a freight train. You had a sister, Talia, a twin. You were both born healthy, but your father, he only wanted one heir, one child to carry the Monroe name. When she was just a few weeks old, he sent her away, paid off doctors, changed records, made sure no one ever spoke of her again. And I let him. I let it happen because I was young and scared, and I thought I had no choice. My hands were shaking now, my breath shallow. I don't know where she is. I don't know if she ever knew about you, but I do know that she deserved better, that you deserved better. And if there's one thing I can do before I leave this world, it's to give you the truth, to let you decide what to do with it. I am so sorry, my sweet girl. I hope one day you'll understand. Love, Mother. The letter slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor. My mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts, memories that suddenly felt like they had cracks I had never noticed before. a sister, a twin, erased, just like I had almost been. I didn't know whether to scream or cry or laugh at the sheer insanity of it all. But I did know one thing. I had spent years believing I was alone, and now I wasn't so sure anymore. The letter sat on the floor where I had dropped it, the words still burning into my mind, twisting through my thoughts like smoke from a fire I hadn't realized had been smoldering all these years. A twin, a sister. A part of me that had been stolen before I ever had the chance to know she existed. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to force my racing thoughts into some kind of order. I felt like the ground beneath me had cracked open, like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, looking down into a truth that had been hidden from me for nearly 4 decades. I forced myself to breathe. One inhale, one exhale. Again, again. The sterile lights in the bank's security room flickered above me, the walls too white, too clean, too indifferent to the storm raging inside me. I needed to move, to get out of there before the weight of it all collapsed on top of me. My hands trembled as I grabbed the letter, folding it with slow, deliberate care before slipping it back into the envelope. The key to the safety deposit box was still in my other hand, the cold metal pressing against my palm. It felt heavier now, like it carried the weight of everything I had just learned. I barely remembered leaving the bank. The air outside was colder than before, the wind biting at my skin as I stepped onto the sidewalk, but I barely felt it. The city stretched out around me, glowing, pulsing, oblivious to the fact that my world had just been turned upside down. A sister, a twin. She was out there somewhere, living a life I had never known, carrying a name that wasn't mine, maybe with no idea that I even existed. Or maybe she did know. Maybe she had spent her whole life wondering about me, the way I was now desperate to know everything about her. I pulled my phone from my clutch with shaking hands, my fingers hovering over the screen. Who the hell was I supposed to call? The police? A private investigator? Some long-buried instinct told me that if my father had erased my sister from existence, he had made sure there were no traces left behind. He was thorough, he was calculated, but he wasn't invincible. I took a deep breath and dialed the only number that made sense. Dr. Calloway picked up on the second ring. Talia? His voice was groggy, the kind of tired that suggested he had barely made it home from the gala before collapsing into bed. What's wrong? I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. How the hell was I supposed to say this out loud? I need your help. There was a pause, then the sound of rustling sheets as he sat up. Where are you? Midtown. Just left a bank. At midnight? His voice sharpened. Talia, what's going on? I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Not over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Another pause. Yeah. My office in 20 minutes? Make it 15. I hung up before he could ask anything else and flagged down a cab, barely registering the driver's mumbled greeting as I slid into the back seat. The ride to Columbia's campus was a blur of neon lights and half-formed thoughts, my fingers clutching the envelope like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. By the time the cab pulled up in front of Calloway's building, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go. The door to his office was already open when I got there. Calloway stood behind his desk, his expression tense as he took in my face, the way I was gripping the envelope like my life depended on it. Talk to me. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. I found something, I said, my voice tight. Or more like, something was left for me. He frowned, motioning for me to sit, but I didn't. I paced instead, too wired, too restless. It's about my father, about my mother, about... I stopped, swallowing hard. I had a sister, Calloway, a twin. His eyebrows shot up. What? I handed him the letter, my fingers brushing against his as he took it. She was taken, given away. My father didn't want 2 daughters, so he made sure there was only one. Calloway's face darkened as he read. By the time he finished, he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I muttered. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally, he looked up. You said your father erased her. That means no records, no paper trail. I know. He studied me for a long moment. But you're going to find her anyway. It wasn't a question. I met his gaze, my jaw tightening. Damn right I am. He nodded, like he had expected nothing less. Then let's start with what we can find. He turned to his laptop, already typing before I had even taken a breath. If your mother knew about this, there has to be something. A name, a doctor, a hospital. We just have to find the right crack in the story. I swallowed hard, the reality of it hitting me all over again. I had spent so many years thinking I was alone in this world, fighting for a place that was only ever meant for me. But now, there was someone else. Someone who had been taken from me before I even knew she existed. And no matter what it took, I was going to bring her back. The glow from Calloway's laptop illuminated his face, the flickering reflection of data scrolling across his glasses as he worked. His office was quiet, except for the soft tapping of keys, and the occasional rustle of paper as he flipped through old medical directories he had pulled from his bookshelf. I sat across from him, my knee bouncing impatiently, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached. The letter sat beside me, still folded neatly, as if keeping it in perfect condition could somehow control the chaos it had unleashed in my mind. She would have been born in the same hospital as you, Calloway muttered, mostly to himself. So if your father wanted her erased, that means forged records, sealed documents, or someone high up who owed him a favor. I exhaled sharply, trying to keep my thoughts straight. My father had money, power. If he wanted something buried, it stayed buried. Calloway nodded, not looking up, which means we're not looking for official hospital records. We're looking for the gaps, the inconsistencies. His fingers moved across the keyboard at a steady rhythm, searching, filtering, cross-referencing. You said your mother didn't know where she was taken? I shook my head, my throat tight. She didn't say, or maybe she never asked. He hummed under his breath, frowning at the screen. Hospitals don't just lose babies, Talia. If she was taken somewhere else, there's a record of a transfer. Even if they changed her name later, there has to be something. He stopped. I leaned forward. What? He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the screen. There's an anomaly in the birth records from the hospital where you were born. He turned the laptop so I could see. There's a gap. A missing entry. One that should be there but isn't. My stomach clenched as I read the lines of data. There it was, buried in a long list of hospital records, a patient entry that had been logged but never officially recorded. The timestamp was just minutes after my own birth. But instead of a name, instead of any identifying details, it was labeled only as transferred, no record. A shiver ran down my spine. Someone tried to erase her, Calloway murmured, as if he had just uncovered something unspeakable. But they didn't do a perfect job. I forced myself to breathe. Where was she transferred to? Calloway scrolled, clicking through files, accessing layers of information that most people would never know existed. His fingers hovered over a highlighted entry, his expression tightening. A private facility, not a hospital, more like a clinic. And it's not in New York. I leaned closer. Where? He hesitated, then turned the screen back to me. Chicago. The word sent a pulse of something electric through my veins. I stared at the name of the facility, my heart hammering. Lakewood Family Medical. The first had never heard of it, but my gut told me that was where she had been taken. I swallowed hard. Is it still open? Calloway was already typing. No. Shut down 15 years ago. Records sealed. Of course they were. I pushed back from the chair, pacing the small office. There has to be something. Employees. Doctors who worked there. Someone who remembers what happened. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. If she was adopted, that means her records were changed. Legally, she wouldn't even be connected to you anymore. The only thing tying her to you is the truth. And the truth doesn't always leave a paper trail. I stopped pacing. Then we find someone who doesn't need a paper trail. His brow furrowed. What are you thinking? I hesitated, then grabbed my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the number I hadn't dialed in years. My hands shook slightly as I hit call. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Talia? I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. Uncle Leo. Calloway's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Leo Monroe wasn't technically my uncle. He was my father's younger brother, the black sheep of the family, the one who had never quite fit into the pristine world my father had built. He had walked away from the Monroe Empire years ago, choosing a life in the shadows rather than in boardrooms. But that also meant he knew things people weren't supposed to know. I need a favor, I said, my voice steady. A pause, then a dry chuckle. Now that's unexpected. I exhaled. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. There was another beat of silence, then a resigned sigh. Where are you, Columbia? Calloway's office. A low hum of approval. Smart choice. That man actually has a soul. Your father must hate him. Calloway shot me a look, but I ignored it. Can you meet me? I asked. Another pause. Then, 30 minutes. The line went dead. I set my phone down, my hand still gripping the edges. Calloway leaned back in his chair. I don't know if I should be impressed or terrified that you just called in a favor from Leo Monroe. I ran a hand through my hair. Both. Leo was a wild card. He was the one person in the family my father had never been able to control, and that made him dangerous. But it also made him useful, because if anyone knew the truth about what had happened to my sister, it was him, and I was about to find out exactly what he had been hiding. The knock on Calloway's office door came exactly 29 minutes later. I barely had time to exhale before it swung open, and there he was, Leo Monroe, looking every bit like the man my father had spent years pretending didn't exist. His suit was expensive but slightly disheveled, his salt and pepper hair swept back like he hadn't bothered with a mirror, and his sharp blue eyes, the same damn ones I had inherited, landed on me with something between amusement and calculation. Well, well, he said, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. Didn't think I'd ever get a call from you. I crossed my arms, steadying myself. Desperate times, he smirked. Clearly. His gaze flickered to Calloway, then to the open laptop on the desk. Looks like you've been busy. Calloway, to his credit, didn't say anything, just watched with that careful, measured expression he always had when dealing with people who weren't entirely predictable. Leo strolled over to the desk and picked up the letter from my mother, scanning it with a slow, deliberate glance. So, she finally cracked, huh? He set it down, shaking his head. I was wondering how long it would take. I tensed. You knew. He met my eyes, something unreadable passing through his expression. I knew. My pulse pounded, and you never thought to tell me? Leo exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Talia, one spent years trying to keep myself out of your father's crosshairs. That meant keeping my distance. And that meant staying the hell away from things he didn't want uncovered. I clenched my jaw. That's not an excuse. His expression darkened slightly. No, it's not. Silence stretched between us, thick and charged. Then he let out a breath and leaned against the desk, his fingers drumming against the wood. I don't know exactly where she is, he admitted, but I know how to find her. One straightened. How? Leo's gaze locked onto mine. Because I know who took her. A chill ran down my spine. The doctor who handled the transfer, the one who helped make her disappear? He wasn't just some random physician your father paid off. He was someone inside the family's circle. My stomach turned. Who? Leo's lips pressed together. And then he said the last name I ever expected to hear. Dr. Richard Kavanaugh. The world tilted. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the chair. That's not possible. Kavanaugh wasn't just some name from the past. He was still active, still respected, still running one of the most prestigious private medical institutions in Chicago. He had been one of my father's closest associates, someone who had attended every gala, Every fundraiser, someone I had shaken hands with more times than I could count. Someone who had known all along. Leo studied my reaction, then nodded slightly like he had expected it. Yeah, that's what I thought too. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. If he handled the transfer, then he knows exactly where she is. Leo nodded. And if I had to guess, he's the only one who still does. Calloway leaned forward. Then we need to get to him before your father figures out what you're doing. Leo smirked. That's the fun part. I already did. My head snapped up. What? Leo pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before holding it up for us to see. A video feed flickered to life, a grainy security camera recording of a dimly lit office, where a man in an expensive suit was pacing behind a desk, rubbing his temples like he was trying to ward off a headache. Kavanaugh. Leo's voice was casual, but there was a sharp edge to it. I paid him a visit earlier tonight. Let's just say, he wasn't thrilled to see me. On the screen, Kavanaugh suddenly turned, his expression tense. He reached for something, a glass of scotch, maybe before exhaling heavily and sinking into his chair. Then he muttered something, and Leo rewound the footage before playing it again, this time with the volume turned up. She doesn't know, Kavanaugh said, his voice rough. She never knew. My breath hitched. Leo paused the video. That's all he said before he told me to get the hell out. But I think we both know exactly who he was talking about. My sister. I gripped the arms of the chair, forcing my thoughts into some kind of order. We need to confront him, I said. We need answers. Leo raised an eyebrow. And you think he'll just hand them over? No. I met his gaze, my own resolve hardening. But he'll talk if he knows what's good for him. Leo chuckled. Now that's the Monroe spirit. I ignored him, turning to Calloway. I need a flight to Chicago. Calloway sighed but didn't argue. I'll book it. Leo stretched, rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a fight. Guess. I'm coming with you then. I shot him a look. I don't remember inviting you, he smirked. You didn't. But trust me, you're gonna want me there. I didn't have the energy to argue. I grabbed my bag, slipping the letter back inside. In less than 24 hours, I would be standing face to face with the man who had stolen my sister's life before it even began. And no matter what it took, I was going to bring her back. After everything, after the betrayal, the search, the confrontation, I realized something. The truth isn't always easy to hear, but it's even harder to live without. My father tried to erase me. He tried to erase her. But in the end, the truth still came out. And now I have one last mission to find my sister, to reclaim the life he stole from us. If this were your story, would you stop here, or would you keep searching? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that the truth should never be buried, share this story because someone out there needs to hear it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth always finds a way out. No matter how much power, money, or influence someone has, secrets don't stay buried forever. I spent years believing I was alone, that my worth was defined by the people who abandoned me. But I was wrong. We are not bound by the past others create for us, we forge our own futures. In this country, we value resilience, the fight for justice, and the right to know where we come from. If something feels wrong, dig deeper. Demand answers. The truth is always worth the battle.